Hmm. Yes, which is partly why he throws all the dramatis personae, like here's all the people, but yeah, that's a lot of people to be talking about and trying to remember as he's reading that. And yeah, this is definitely much more boiled down. Because their parties ended up commingled anyway, right? Their climbing groups ended up with mixed parties. They ended up all kind of commingled with one another in some way or other. Except for Krakauer, who, what? He was kind of a solo cat, right? He was going to do all this pretty much on his own. Didn't have a whole lot of guide support, didn't have a whole lot of Sherpa support. He was just kind of seeing if he could do it on his own. All right, how about how did they line up? How were they similar? How do they compare? That's always the harder one, right? It's easy to figure out how they're different. Yes, because they had some accountability, right? Each of them had some responsibility in it, and I would agree with that. That both of them are struggling a little bit to figure out how responsible they are, and by trying to deal with that struggle, they blame each other. All right, that gives us at least a good foundation with regard to that. And so let's look at something from an accident standpoint. So anytime we have a mishap or an accident, in this case we have a major accident, whether it's 16 Sherpas a couple weeks ago that got killed or the 8 people that died in this climbing season. James Reason was a British psychologist, industrial organizational psychologist was his background. So he was interested in a couple of things, aviation world and hospitals, because accidents in those environments end up really getting people hurt or killed. And so that's who he focused on with particular interest upon the aviation world. And what he came up with is what he calls the Swiss cheese model of accident investigation or accident analysis. So he says anytime we have a bad thing happen, the initial tendency is to do what? Who do we blame? If a plane crashes, pilot error, right? Let's blame the pilots. Let's blame the people in charge. Let's blame the operators themselves, right? And that's oftentimes what happens, and that makes people or helps people feel better because they're like, oh, those pilots or those people screwed up. But as far as really fully, truly understanding what happened, it doesn't get us very far, right? So if we look at MH370 or whatever that's going on right now, right? That plane is yet to be found. All those people probably dead, right? No idea where it is. And we could say, wow, there's something those pilots did. That's pretty hinky. And we could blame it specifically on them and leave it at that and not really ever fully understand what transpired. Same thing here on the mountain. When we've got those people dead, we could say, you know, inherent risk, they did something that screwed something up and they got themselves killed. That's not going to allow us to fully understand it. And so what Reason came along and said, we need to understand error from a much more complex nature. And we need to look, what he said was upstream from the end state. This is the end state. We know something bad happened. We need to look upstream from there and figure out what was in place before that accident happened so that we can try and address it and fix it if possible. He said we throw up these barriers in order to try and eliminate error from happening. In order to try and mitigate risk, we put barriers up. In this case, we put a barrier here. We put a barrier here, here, and here. Unfortunately, these barriers that we throw up are inherently defective, right? They have holes in them. They're not perfect defenses. And his theory says that when the holes line up in these defenses, that's when something bad happens. So if we have a bunch of dead people on Everest, we could blame those dead people for their unsafe acts, for their active failures, and yet we need to look upstream and say, what was in place right before those folks died? What kind of condition were those people in when they died? So as human operators, what was going on for them? Altitude, right? Hypoxic, which is basically the equivalent of being pretty drunk. So they're more or less drunk. Uh, from a from a communication standpoint, what was the level of communication between people, between teams, all sorts of things that were in place before that accident happened, right? There were lots of issues there. So we have weaknesses in this defense. Unsafe supervision. So in this example, the supervisors would be who? The guides, exactly. Were the guides perfect? No. Buchareve wasn't perfect. The Sherpas weren't perfect. There were flaws in their defenses. Right, and then lastly, who are the organizations involved? Lots of different organizations involved. Mountain Madness, Adventure Consultants, the governments of these countries, all sorts of organizations in place, right, that are also trying to stop that error. And again, that defense has got some inherent weaknesses to it. So when those line up, right, that's when that accident occurs. Let's take a look at an example. So unsafe acts, right? That's the Khumbu Icefall. That's where the avalanche happened. That's where all those guys got wiped out a couple weeks ago. This is what you have to go through before you even begin climbing the mountain to get up to Camp 1. And what are these? Those are just aluminum ladders that you buy at Ace Hardware. There's nothing elaborate there. There's nothing super sexy about it. It's just a bunch of aluminum ladders taped together, right, with duct tape and bungee cords, and then anchored into the ice, hopefully, so that, right, when you walk across that in your crampons, that's what you got. So that's just inherently risky. That's just unsafe. There's some things we can do to mitigate some of that risk, but we're never going to get that all the way. This stuff's moving all the time, right? That's just an active avalanche chute with all these huge cirrax that come down. Right, from a precondition standpoint, we got people that are under oxygen most of the time, right? Is really just amazing to read any of them. What was their physical level of health? Terrible, right? The minute like they got to Kathmandu, you got gastrointestinal things going. You're not eating. You're throwing up all the time. You're dehydrated. You've got some sort of upper respiratory thing going on for almost all of them. So you're trying to do this immensely difficult physical exercise to get to the mountain, and you're at what, maybe 50%? Maybe, because of how broken down you've gotten from all these different things. So there's all sorts of preconditions that are just setting the stage for something to happen. And then from a supervisory standpoint, the guides aren't perfect. Buchareve wasn't perfect, right? The Sherpas weren't perfect. All of the other people that were in this whole mix, they had some liabilities too, and those things helped contribute to the overall negative effects that happened. And then lastly, from an organizational standpoint, if we look at the governments in particular, and there are several involved with trying to climb it, you paid what, $5,000-$10,000 of each of the 70 grand went to the country for your permit. What did the country give in return? What did Nepal give in return for you giving them $10,000 to climb Everest? A piece of paper, right? A license. Other than that, what did they get? Absolutely nothing. So here you've got a government entity putting a huge tax on these people, and then from a service standpoint, really providing nothing at all, right? No rescue teams in base camp. No police or law enforcement presence to try and deal with everything that's happening. Really no support services whatsoever. Last year was the first season, finally, where they were able to get some sort of a go rescue team that just hangs out in camp. In case something bad happens, these folks are paid and equipped to just hang out and then go if something bad happens, right? But it took how long for something like that to get into place? A long time, and a lot of people dead before they figure out, oh, that'd be something probably pretty clever that we could come up with. So again, the governments are benefiting tremendously financially, but really providing very, very little in terms of services. And so then, as those holes line up, we've got something really, really bad happen. And according to Reason's model, all you have to do is plug one of these holes. Just plug it at some level. Some supervisor does a better job. Some organization comes up with a better policy to try and address something. Somebody gets on oxygen or somebody does something before that negative effect happens, and we stop it right there. That's the philosophy, is that we can stop air. We don't have to plug all of them, just one of them. All right, let's take a look at an example. All right, so we've heard about this for a long period of time, which is basically that doctor fatigue is hurting patients. And doctor fatigue in specifically from who? Interns, right? As part of your internship program as a doc, right? We know and have known for a long period of time that interns are hurting and killing a lot of their patients. Why is that? Okay, so initially we might say, man, they're just crappy doctors, I guess, right? They must not be very good. They must not have studied very well in class. They must not have done very well with regard to their academic training because they're getting people hurt, right? We could blame it on them down here. We could blame it at the operator level. All right, if we were to use this model, right, instead of stopping right here and blaming it on them, we would say, well, what's the precondition in place before they're getting somebody hurt? They're tired, right? What's a typical shift? 24 to 48 hours. Can you imagine that? You're a doctor, you're an intern, a young doctor. You're really not even a doctor yet, you're an intern. And your scheduling demands are that you could be up for 24 to 48 hours, and all of a sudden something happens, mass casualty or whatever it is, and you've got literally a bunch of people's lives in your hands, and you haven't slept in 2 days. And you've got to make critical, super time-sensitive decisions right now that are going to affect whether somebody lives or dies. I'd want no part of that, right? No part of that. And yet that's what the system allows. That's the expectation. That's the norm in the system, right? So we've got a bunch of young docs who are super tired and not in a conditional state where they're able to make as good a decisions as possible. Supervisory level. Who's the supervisors of those interns? The attending, right? So where's the attending? We don't know where the attending is. The attending not doing a very good job? Is the attending out playing golf? Is the attending got too many of these young docs that he or she has to supervise? Yes. All right, and then organizationally, who are the organizations? The hospitals themselves. Why do the hospitals allow this to happen? Right? Because I got a bunch of young docs that get a lot of work done and I don't have to pay them squat, right? That's the money trail. You're getting the least developed care as possible from the most inexperienced people as possible, and yet the billing's the same, right? So that's a really good deal financially for the hospital that's able to utilize such a system. So they're responsible as well. So if we plug that at one level, those young interns aren't making as many mistakes down here. Sure, they're accountable. They have to be responsible for what they do, but we could sure help them out by changing their scheduling demands so they're not up for that long. We could sure help them out by making sure that they have a much more reasonable chain of command, or a command and control profile that's like 2 or 3 of these people to one attending, which we don't have now. And then lastly, the hospitals could say, we're not going to schedule people for 48-hour shifts. We're not going to use such a format. We're not going to use so many of them. We're going to change the way we do business, even if it means we have to pay a little bit more money. So again, we plug it at any level, all those needless patient deaths down here, or a lot of them, stop. All right, questions on that? That's how we take that and apply it to a model if we're interested in, man, I screwed up. Why did I screw up? Or why did that person screw up? And moving past just blaming them, which is really easy, and saying, what was upstream of that screw up that we could maybe also fix? Right? Questions? Not sure what, oh, right. Evaluations. I need a volunteer. We can probably cut that. Thank you, Nicole.